afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Delray Beach Public Library. My name is Isabella Rowan, and I am the program coordinator here at the library. This program is being recorded, so please remain muted until the end of the talk when we will take questions and comments. You are welcome to type your questions or remarks in the chat box or simply raise your hand. Delray Beach Public Library is super excited to be one of 20 organizations in the state of Florida to receive the Florida Talks Spring 2022 Programming Grant from Florida Humanities. Florida Talks, one of Florida Humanities' longest running programs, offers nonprofit organizations across Florida a way to host thought-provoking and engaging presentations by experts and scholars from their Distinguished Speakers Bureau. Today's program is a partnership between the Florida Humanities and Delray Beach Public Library. Funding for this program was provided by Florida Humanities and sponsored in part by the State of Florida Department of State Division of Arts and Culture and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture. When you have big ideas for library programs but have a small budget, grants such as this are extremely valuable, and we are very grateful to be a recipient. Just in time for Women's History Month, today's program, entitled Florida Food in the Golden Era of Women's Page Journalism, will take us back to the 1950s and 60s to the women's pages in Florida newspapers, where we will meet three pioneering women food journalists. Our speaker today is Dr. Kimberly Voss, professor of journalism at the University of Central Florida. She has published 4 books about women and mass media, many of the journalists from Florida. She researches journalism in the 1950s and 60s, newspaper, food history, and fashion journalism, as well as political club women and the Equal Rights Amendment in Florida. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kimberly Voss.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.
I study the women's pages of the 1950s and the 1960s. And these are sections that were inherently important to the communities that they were in, as I'll talk about briefly today, particularly in Florida. But newspaper history, social history, a lot of places ignore the women's pages. Because it was kind of embarrassing looking back at the 1950s and 60s, because women were not allowed to be journalists outside of the women's pages. And so a lot of history has ignored them. But as I'll talk about today, they were actually amazing. I mean, being marginalized, of course, was not great, but they did great things within the agency they had. And part of the women's pages was food history, everyday food, consumerism, recipes, what we did. And Florida, to me, is just amazing in that way. So just to kind of give you an idea to start out with, key lime pie and Florida. So now most folks, we can get almost every ingredient year round, right? Because they come from other countries, we have trucking, we have all sorts of transportation concepts. But it used to be that there was regional cooking. You would make what was local, what mattered. And key lime pie is one of my favorites. And part of it, and I purposely use this image, is greenish. And of course, if you make key lime pie, it's not green, it's yellow. And one of the complaints of many of these women's page editors and food editors was that all sorts of grocery stores, Publix and the others, would actually use food coloring to make it green. And that was for the tourist. They expected this. But part of what's also important here is that these women's page journalists and the food editors were considered unimportant except for these kinds of issues. Suddenly they were experts. Prior to this, they weren't important at all. But these things really, really mattered. And so Anne McDuffie, who was the food editor at the Tampa Tribune that we'll talk about in a second, she was quoted in many national newspapers about her concerns that the country would think that key lime pie should be green. So Florida Women's Pages, briefly, it used to be at a newspaper, and this began in the 1880s, all the way up into about the 1970s. Women, other than a few exceptions, could only work at a newspaper if they were in the women's pages. And this was part of every major metro newspaper. And it literally said that you're in the women's pages. There wasn't a question of who you were, where you were, who you were, what you covered. So this photo right here, in the far front is Dorothy Journey. The woman that's kind of also facing with her head down, in wearing the white outfit with the glasses, was Marie Anderson. This is the Miami Herald in 1950. And so again, a lot of places acted as if the women's pages were the worst, if they're covered at all. But these women found a way to make a difference. You notice here they got those old typewriters. You can see all of the paper coming out. This was, though, significant because they owned women's news. No one else covered it. Their editors didn't care about it. So they had a lot of freedom to do a lot of different things, which included food, which they were the authorities of. There was no male editor that covered food. This was their domain, what mattered. And you'll notice here that they're in a room of their own, and that happened across the country. Women were not allowed into the newsroom of major newspapers. And part of it I always thought was funny was that the theory was that women couldn't handle cursing. And I've spent a lot of my career looking at their letters back and forth, and they cursed as well as anyone. So these women's pages had what they called the 4 F's: family, food, furnishings, and fashion. And that was really where women at this point in time, they could do whatever they want. And these things also intersected with, politics, the economy, local issues, but it was theirs. And while that's not necessarily covered by historians, journalism historians specifically, they knew what they were doing, and they knew how to take control of what mattered. And that's important too for their audiences, right? So what the audiences wanted, they delivered. So just to give you a brief background of how do I know what I know? And that's really because if you look on the left of those files, pretty much every newspaper, including many that have gone under, and so I've been able to look at those things too. This was what readers were asking about, what really mattered. This was a point in time, so this is pre-Google, pre the internet, and you wanted, say, a specific recipe or how to display your table. You called the newspaper and they would send you for free that information. I mean, that was significant for the connection between newspapers and readership. You'll see here these booklets, this one, Famous Florida Recipes, done by Jeanne Voltz, we'll talk about more in a minute, from the Miami Herald. And these connections were so important. When you read about the readers, it mattered so much. And they would write letters sometimes almost out of loneliness to connect with their women's section. Here's one more. If you look there, there's a whole collection of, those are all cookbooks that Jeanne Voltz, who spent more than a decade at the Miami Herald and then the LA Times, wrote. These were important. They went beyond just kind of writing about their immediate newspaper sections to write cookbooks. On the other side was the card for James Beard. Obviously, many of us probably know James Beard, but this was also great research to be able to look at who he was connecting to, who he was talking to. So this was one of the Rolodexes of one of the food editors. And you can kind of see where he's crossed out, where it was crossed out where he used to live. So James Beard is on the far left here. And I like this photo because it was incredibly important. While James Beard, Craig Claiborne were important, they were only important because of the, initially anyway, the women that wrote about them. I do think if James was alive today, he would be shocked and saddened that his name has been overshadowed by the women that discovered him. Both James Beard and Craig Claiborne were first covered in the New York Times and other newspapers only because of Jane Nickerson, who I'll talk about soon. So one of the things that were incredibly important in understanding who these women were and what they did were based on the Penny Missouri Awards. So beginning in the 1960s, the Penny Missouri Awards recognized food, fashion, and the women's pages. And I mention that because no one else did nationally. These women couldn't belong to, say, the Society of Professional Journalists. There were no Pulitzer Prizes for their work. So these women kind of worked together to find their place. So this is Edie Green. She covered some of the food meetings that we'll talk about. And I loved her take on how hard it was to be a food critic, because she said you couldn't eat much because you gained so much weight when you were judging. So that's her standing there on the left. On the right, she's sitting. So she was at the Penny Missouri Awards training others. And that was a big part of what these women did. So Edie Green was the food editor and women's page editor at the Fort Lauderdale News. Initially, she was a stay-at-home mom who took care of her children. And then one day her husband decided to leave her for the woman next door after 17 years of marriage. And so Edie had to get a job out of nowhere. And so she decided that she was going to work at the Orlando Sentinel. She ultimately ended up marrying the sports editor, and the Sentinel, like many newspapers, said you couldn't marry. So she had to leave, and they both went to Fort Lauderdale. If you've ever been on the Greenway in Orlando, that was named for her son, one of her three sons who died very young. But Edie was a woman who not only helped others, but she created a space for women in domestic violence. One of the biggest domestic violence shelters in Broward County was named because of what she did. So going back to food a little bit more, recipe exchanges and German chocolate cake. If you look at history, it used to be said that a woman's name should be in the newspaper only 3 times: when you were born, when you were married, and when you died. I would argue that there's a 4th reason. If you were such a good cook that your recipes got into the newspaper, that was a big deal too. And I know that really does matter because I've looked at obituaries where it's mentioned that a woman who may have been staying at home and volunteering didn't have much of a public connection. If she was in the newspaper for her food, it mattered. And so I'd like talking about German chocolate cake for a second, because this was in the 1960s. And there used to be food editors meetings. So women at newspapers across the country that covered food would go to these meetings. And so this one happened to be in Chicago in the 60s. And one of the editors mentioned, oh, there's this cake that everyone's making in Texas. Everyone's doing it. It's very unique to Texas. And the Chicago editor said, oh, no, everyone's making German chocolate cake. It's not German from the standpoint of being from the country. It was because the chocolate company's food engineer was from, last name was German, and he studied chocolate. But these were the kinds of things that showed the impact of food editors, because these food editors were writing about this all the time. So regional cooking was changing to be national, because each one of these food editors would write about these things. And these recipe exchanges were important because it was a sense of communication, right? If someone wanted to know how to make something, they'd lost a recipe. This wasn't a time when you had Google or the internet, so you really kind of trusted the readership to write in. And this happened across the country, especially in Florida. I also think it's important to talk about communicating with recipes. And I noticed as I looked at my research, people would write, it was only a recipe, as if it didn't matter. And of course, we communicate through recipes, right? It's a great moment of respect to say, can you share this cookie recipe or this pasta recipe or the sauce recipe? It mattered. So I always love this concept. So this slide mentioned the back of a woman's gravestone. Every time someone asked for a cookie recipe, she said, "Over my dead body." And there's the recipe. And I think these things really did matter. They connected, they gave power, they gave control, and they connected families, because sometimes it was a special thing to give someone else the recipe. This is how much it mattered. I will share it with you. So moving back to Florida a little bit more. Florida has some of the best cookbooks, and one of my favorite is the Gasparilla Cookbook. So this is Anne McDuffie, who I mentioned to you earlier, and I talked to some of her old colleagues, and it was kind of a big deal in the state of Florida, but also nationally. Anne McDuffie had an office up with upper management. I've never heard of that before. She was considered that important. So this is one of the stories she wrote about fruitcakes. She helped in the test kitchen of the Gasparilla Cookbook. She was a big, big deal. And food editors are often not given the credit I think they deserve. And I also love this cover of the Gasparilla Cookbook, because I've read about the artist who drew it. And just, I mean, isn't it amazing? He's a tough guy, right? But carrying the food. And, you know, he's a pirate, but he's also the kind of guy that might, you know, work with food. And I think that's always amazing. But the Gasparilla Cookbook, which was a fundraising cookbook for the Junior League of Tampa, which was important too, because these cookbooks helped change their communities. The money they raised helped create all sorts of social services. Sometimes it was about helping older folks and food. It was about helping homeless children have backpacks. It was helping hungry people. They were really amazing, but it's easy to dismiss cookbooks, I think, rather than what they really did. One of the things that made the Gasparilla Cookbook a big deal is, if you can notice here, that's Jackie, former First Lady Jackie Kennedy, Jackie Onassis here, with her daughter, and under her arm is the Gasparilla Cookbook. And that was from a World's Fair. And so that made national coverage, and it really, really helped the cookbook find its place. And so this cookbook mattered for food reasons. If you read it, it's truly amazing. And it's women's work overall. There were 2 recipes for men. One was shrimp with beer, and that was the only part of the recipe, but it's still fun. Clementine Paddleford was a national, probably the biggest deal national editor in the 1950s and early 60s in newspapers. This was a time when most food editors had pen names, but Clementine Paddleford was born that way. That was her name. She's from Kansas. And so she came out to Tampa to write about the cookbook, to give a review. And a lot of her letters that talk about her visit to Tampa are at Kansas State and are just amazing. And then I need to mention Jeannie Voltz, because she's just amazing. Jeannie Voltz began her career in Alabama. She went to college for journalism prior to World War II. Then she started working at a newspaper during World War II. And this was significant for many of the women I write about, because they could do things they never could have done before. Because women weren't allowed to cover news until World War II, when many male editors went to serve in the war. And so she often mentioned how difficult it was, because she was writing constantly about the death of soldiers that she had knew in school. She eventually makes her way to the Miami Herald, and she started working there as a copy editor. And eventually she had a back injury. And she went to the doctor, and the doctor gave her one of my favorite recommendations, which was, it would be better for you to be a reporter than take care of 2 young children at home. And if you've ever had young children, there's a lot to that statement. But she had never cooked before. The official cookbook of the Miami Herald, or the official history of the Miami Herald, said that she was a gourmet cook. She never was. But she learned how to cook, and she traveled the state of Florida, figuring out how she was going to write about the history, about our food. She wrote about seafood and produce, because it was very different, of course, back in the 1950s compared to today. But she was amazing. And she did some great things. She wrote 2 cookbooks about Florida. This was her home. She wrote some of the first barbecue recipes. James Beard, who I mentioned earlier, said she was the utmost authority about barbecue, which of course is kind of a big deal, considering that now we think everyone cooks barbecue, but she was one of the first ones to do that. She asked for a raise in 1960, and she was told she could not have it. So she went to be the food editor at the LA Times for the next 12 years. She was followed by Virginia Huffington. So this is one of these books that newspapers often produce. So this is Florida, Food with a Florida Flair. And they were kind of these, you can find them like on eBay nowadays. There were these kind of very tiny cookbooks, but these were kitchen tested with local foods, that sort of thing. Virginia, unlike Jeannie Voltz, who had a journalism degree, Virginia Huffington had a home ec degree, which is not uncommon at the time. She was from Iowa State, so she learned how to cook versus learning how to write in that way. And so Virginia did the same kinds of work. And so she went later on to California also. And so she was covering a cookbook that had been written by Liberace. And it turned out Liberace was not a great cook. And so she said that in this meeting in Liberace's kitchen, where everyone else was there, and he kicked her out of the kitchen. And so that was covered nationally. So she had an interesting story too. She also covered, as many others did, kind of news, food related stories. So here she's writing about the food that prisoners ate when they were in jail. They also wrote about things like what would patients eat at a hospital, what would students eat when they were at school. So they had a combination of these important news stories. One of my favorite cookbooks ever is Who Says We Can't Cook? You'll notice it's not a question mark, but an exclamation mark. And this particular story I'm showing you came from Harrietta Pointer, right? Who's from the St. Pete Times. And her information was largely based on the fact that she was raising her siblings, and whatever money she could save, she could keep, which of course as a teenager was incredibly important. This is Bertha Cochrane. She was at the Miami News. She was one of the women who ended up doing what she did because she had worked during the war as a nurse's assistant. So she had a home ec degree from Purdue. After the war, using the GI Bill. She went to Miami to get a degree in journalism and wrote important things for the Miami News. As I'm getting closer to the end here, one of my favorite people is Grace from Orlando. You notice here she has her cookbook, Cooking with Grace. She had a family history in Orlando. Her dad was a judge. She ended up being a single mom with just 2 children, or just her and 2 children, I should say. And she really found a way at the newspaper. She started in society, turned to food, and she ended up writing this book. And one of my favorite things was that she was known, particularly in Winter Park, all her dessert recipes began with take a stick of butter. So non-fat was not really an issue, but her recipes are amazing. And I got to read her son's papers at the Florida Historical Society. Following Grace was Dorothy Chapman. And Dorothy was known for, if you can see here on the side, she would write cookbooks. She had a column, Thought You'd Never Ask, which was known as being the most common, the most popular column in the Orlando Sentinel. And what she would have to do was figure out how to take recipes from the big restaurants in Orlando, like at the theme parks. How do you give information? How do you take that to the point that you could cook for your family, right? Because as a chef at these places, it was very large. And another thing about Dorothy Chapman was she was also a single mother of 3 daughters. And she asked at one point in time if she could be the copy editor at the newspaper. And they told her no, because women couldn't work at night. So she had to work harder because she couldn't make as much money as she wanted to. And one of the things I think is amazing about Dorothy, she put that in her column in the newspaper. She called it her own newspaper to say it wasn't fair. She explained at one point in time, because she couldn't do that kind of work, her daughters didn't get the Christmas presents that they deserved. She was truly amazing. Ruth Gray, in reviewing restaurants. Ruth Gray was a restaurant reviewer at the St. Pete Times. She's kind of the one that's looking right in the screen at you there. Some women reviewed restaurants, some were not allowed because it was kind of too much authority to give these women. Ruth Gray did. And this was a point in time where you kind of had to hide who you were. So she would have to go into a bathroom stall with a pen to make notes. Because the idea here was, if you were reviewing a restaurant and the restaurant staff knew who you were, they would do things to make the meal better than someone who would just eat there as a customer. So Ruth Gray, she was a very sweet lady. When she had to write a negative review, she would leave town for a week. She was that sensitive. She was responsible for at least one chef losing his job after a bad review. Another restaurant named their crab sandwich for her as a way of kind of being critical. I'll finish up with Jane Nickerson. Jane Nickerson was the first female, well, no, I shouldn't say that, the first food editor at the New York Times. She just happened to be a woman. So she started in 1942. From 1942 to 1957, she was the food editor at the New York Times. And she often gets overshadowed because who followed her was Craig Claiborne. And if you know Craig Claiborne, he knew how to promote his work. And he did all of this, and Jane kind of disappeared because of it. And in fact, he wrote kind of the biggest deal New York Times cookbook. But if you look at the time period, most of those recipes appeared under Jane's watch, not his. So Jane Nickerson, 1957, leaves New York and comes to Lakeland, Florida. So that's a picture of her. She was amazing. She had studied writing and journalism prior and did some truly amazing things. She was the first one to write ever about Craig Claiborne and the other, big names of the time, even though she gets kind of forgotten. But I love this cookbook she wrote. You'll notice Jane Nickerson's Florida Cookbook, her name is above it. It's not by Jane Nickerson, it's above. And she was really, truly amazing in what she did, both in New York and in Florida. But again, she sadly gets forgotten way too much at the time. And I've talked to many folks about her, and it just gets forgotten what she did. I was able to look at the New York Times HR files, and it was clear that she was an important, significant journalist throughout the 1950s, despite her marginalization. So I want to finish up talking about mango pie. So I know we're going to put this in the chat if you want the recipe for mango pie, and this comes from Jane's cookbook. I wrote about this at the very beginning of the pandemic, where there were lots of columns about pandemic cooking. And so this is one of my favorites. So this was Jane's, but I always thought it was kind of amazing when the pandemic happened. When I wrote my book about newspaper food history, two things came up pretty regularly. One, bacon has always been common. And second of all, baking bread always came in and out of vogue. And I thought that was so true right during the pandemic, where at the very beginning, everyone wanted to learn how to make bread again. So this is my book, Newspaper Women in the Culinary Community. This is about the 50s and 60s at newspapers, and so many of them were from Florida. Really, Florida was such an important part of women's pages in the 50s and the 60s. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and informative. And it's like, bravo, women writers everywhere, right? That's just astonishing. Does anybody have any questions or comments? There was one question in the chat box that Denise asked, why did Liberace kick her out of the kitchen? And I kind of missed that too. So if you can share that.
Sure. She told him his food was bad.
Like to his face?
Yeah. So he was trying to sell this cookbook. So he's in his kitchen and there's all these food editors around him. And she was just kind of the honest one, I think. She was like, your food isn't any good, which was also a little bit bold. So yeah, he kicked her out of the kitchen. And of course, doing that with all those journalists wasn't always the smartest because they all wrote about it.
Oh my goodness. That's funny. Well, hey, that's good for her for being honest in any way, you know. That's great. I have a question. Well, I actually have two questions for you, and then I will, of course, let other people who are here ask questions as well. But one question I have for you is, as you were doing your research and discovering these different recipes, did you try any of them yourself, the recipes, and how were they?
I did. Well, it is interesting because in the 50s and 60s, there were some things that definitely don't translate.
Like oleo?
Like if you wanted
oleo?
to can something,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of things have changed our expectations. Do you know what I mean? About
right.
temperatures and, technology and that sort of thing. Also, like I said about, Grace Barr, a whole stick of butter, really? So some of it, do you know what I mean, was like altering it from too much fat and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, the flavors still worked. The other thing I think was different for the most part, like right now, like if I want to make something, I might look up this one dish. A lot of the recipes in the 50s and 60s were meals. So the idea was kind of that not that you weren't smart enough, but the home ec people were so experts that they would tell you, here's your main dish, here's your sides, and of course, always, here's your dessert. So sometimes the recipes were different from that standpoint. But for the most part, I would say they really did stand up. One of the things I loved, particularly with Jeanne Voltz, was she did a lot of citrus cooking. And like, it never occurred to me to make orange chicken. And I don't mean like, Chinese food will often have that version.
Right.
This was simply marinating the chicken in orange. It almost cooked it, the citrus in it. So that part was fun, like learning, you know what I mean, what they did in that sort of way. So that was kind of cool.
That is neat. Wow. Okay. And the other question I had was, a lot of these, I noticed in your presentation that a lot of these women, these reporters, went on to publish cookbooks. So, I mean, women in the publishing world is also fraught with terror, if you will. So how were they able to publish their books and have that work,
Well, for many of them, the publisher was their newspaper publisher.
Mm-hmm.
So they were protected, right? Because, the Miami Herald wanted to make sure, it probably happened more in the LA Times now I think about it, but some with Miami Herald. So they had that kind of protection in that way. But without a doubt, there were stories that recipes were stolen.
Oh.
That were taken in that way. And they didn't have much agency to be able to do much with that. Now, I would say, on the other hand, they got to travel in amazing ways at the time, because you would make the argument, I need to see what Chinese food really tastes like, so I need to go to China, right? Or I need to know Italian food. Right? So they had a lot of fun. I think these women knew they were marginalized, but they could take advantage of certain elements. Going back to Jeanne Voltz, she traveled the state of Florida when it was hard to travel the state of Florida. The roads that we think of now were not there. Like, there was a point in time that I remember her mentioning there was just like, cows in the road. And so, it was a challenge, but there was also the point that I read many times that men said they didn't understand cooking. So these women could go to their editors of various, publisher books or newspapers or even magazines and go, I'll go do this. And it was like, okay, you're the only one that knows how. So it was kind of like an interesting moment of power when there was not much in other parts of the newspaper.
Fascinating. Wow. Yeah. There's a question from Amanda. What made you interested in this research? And do you like to cook yourself or create your own recipes?
I was born on the very last day of 1970. So I didn't know the women's pages. When I went to doctoral school, I had a wonderful professor that said, you should study these. And the more I did, the more amazing they were. And oddly enough, so that was back in the 1990s and no one else is studying it, which is like a good, bad, like I get to do everything, but like, it'd be nice if, I wasn't the only one. So yeah, it was amazing what they have done. And the fact that their stories aren't told, I feel very lucky and privileged to tell their stories because almost none of them had children. So I feel like I'm kind of their surrogate, niece or granddaughter, that sort of thing. So I feel very lucky. I like to cook, but more so after studying them because they gave you stories about cooking. They gave you why it mattered and how it was important. And it was kind of fun to see if I could replicate something from the 1950s or 1960s, because there are things that are in those recipes you can't find at the store today. So it was fun. I feel incredibly lucky to tell their stories.
Denise is just making a comment about how good publishers and editors know a good book when they read one. So women were blessed to have these few publishers.
Very true.
Yeah. Is there anyone else has any questions or comments? Amanda says stories definitely make cooking more fun. Yeah, for sure. Especially when you get everybody in the kitchen cooking together and you can just laugh and have a good time, and that's
It's
awesome.
social.
Yes, it is.
I
For
have
sure.
I have a comment.
Uh-huh.
Hi, Kimberly.
Hi.
I'm actually zooming in from Reno, Nevada, and I am a historic food writer here. And I'm always looking for a story. I just never know where I'm going to find a story, right? So I want to thank you because I did not know about the Penny, Missouri, if I have it right, I wrote it down, awards until today. And while I was on with you, I discovered that Florence Burge, who apparently you also reference in your book,
Yeah.
won the award. And so somewhere down the road, when I'm looking for a topic at the right time, I'm going to, feature. And there's quite a bit written. Her archives are here at the university. Well, you probably know all this.
I went
But,
through them. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to be digging. Is there a way I can reach you? Did you post your email?
If I haven't, make sure to do that, Isabella. Also, I'm at UCF, but when it comes to Flo, I actually went through her papers. It was amazing. She saved everything. It was a joy to go through her papers. And I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but there's another food editor that I wrote about in my book. So please reach out. Like I said, I'm at UCF in the journalism program, and feel free to put my email in the chat too. But Nevada had great things, Reno specifically, but also Vegas had Ruthie Deskin, who was a big deal.
Oh, yeah. Matter of fact,
Yeah.
I worked for her daughter for years.
Oh, goodness. Please
Yeah.
contact me. I'd love to talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Nancy,
because
yeah.
I've written about both of them. As I mentioned earlier, I always thought other people were going to write about these women. And so I'm half happy that they haven't, because I could do it, but it's a lot when you're the only one. But yeah, please contact me, because both Flo and Ruthie, I've published about both of them, and I adore them.
Okay. All right. I will. Thank you.
Do you have any other books or projects in the works?
Actually, right before I got your phone call, I just got a new book contract, which is a book contract is the best because you haven't done anything yet, but you can celebrate it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
There's no real work, but yay. So it's going to be advice columns in the 1950s and 60s. Like kind of like not just Dear Abby, but like most local newspapers would have, and you would talk about this and that. But they were important because they helped decide kind of what was acceptable, what wasn't. And there were also everything from, social norms, political issues, and cooking.
Wow, that's great. So do you have like a timeline for any of it?
Someone just asked the question, why not Dear Abby?
Uh-huh.
Because so many books have been written about her, and her sister. Now I will mention them, but the great part about writing that I do is that no one else, they mattered in their time and then they get forgotten. So Dear Abby and Ann Landers, while important, of course, they're so documented. But every newspaper, particularly in Florida, Miami tends to be a lot of my work. There was an advice editor or advice columnist by the name of Eleanor Hart, which wasn't even her real name, in Miami. And she had an advice column where people could write in. So like if you were a reader, you could write something and then she would respond, and then other readers would respond to that. So she wrote about, should women be able to work in the 60s? Can we integrate neighborhoods? Like really important stuff. And I think because it was in the women's pages and advice columns, it was so non-threatening. Oh, what could those women do? But you read it, and I've gone through her. In fact, I went through her papers about 2 years ago today because I was in the archives when the state shut down. I was literally in the archives. I kept getting notices that the mayor of Miami had COVID. They were closing the schools. Like it was like almost bizarre, like in that. But, you know, sometimes if you read advice columns, there's made up names, you know, like Miss Sunshine sent it in. But going through her papers, were their names and addresses and phone numbers. She hid their names for privacy. These are real people writing real letters.
Oh, wow. Oh
Yeah.
my God, I can't wait to read that book.
Well, I'm sending you one for free when it happens.
Thank you. That's going to be awesome. We'll add it to our collection. There's a comment. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was a writer for the Miami paper her father worked for.
Yes.
Did not know that.
Yeah, she's amazing. And she lived forever. She lived into her hundreds. So she wrote for the Miami Herald. And she was a environmentalist before that was a word. She saved the Everglades, well, did what she could to save what we have of the Everglades. But yeah, she was a fun lady. She wrote, was it The River of Grass, I think? And so her writing for the newspaper was kind of before my time period. You know what I mean? It was like the 30s, I think. But she was fun. She stayed friends with many of the women at the Herald, or met them because they would cover her testimony in front of governmental agencies about, you know, taking care of the environment. But she's friends with Helen Muir, who was a longtime columnist at the Herald. They lived about a block away. And if you know anything about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, she lived in this like old house in the middle of nowhere. I don't think she had electricity. You know, it was very old. So Helen lived down the street. And what they would do at the end of the day, they would walk to one woman's house and have a drink together, walk home to the other's house, have another drink together. And this could go on for hours. They were just so fun. And I think that's important too. These activists had fun. They weren't just, you know what I mean, so serious all the time. But Helen Muir started the entire library system in Miami and then Florida. So Helen Muir was the libraries to what Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was to the environment. But boy, they had fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was
That's
very
so
cool.
Awesome. Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise and research and insight with us. It was fascinating. I would like to direct everyone again, remind you to please complete the survey. It only takes a couple of minutes and we value your input. So please grab that out of the chat box before you sign off. And Kimberly, again, thank you so much for everything. It was great to have you here, and good luck with your future book and all of your future projects and research.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.